What is Overdrive? What does it do? And do you need it? So in today's video, I'm going to do the best that I can to answer all three of those questions. What is Overdrive? What does Overdrive do? And do you really need it? So I've got a brand new Treal Overdrive here that I'm going to be installing in my C10. So I'm going to take you out to the indoor course. Going to get some running footage of this. Show you a few different obstacles, and it's wintertime here, so I'm going to get it outside, do a little run around in the snow, kind of show you what it can do, the way it's set up without the overdrive. Then we'll come back in here, I'll show you how to install the overdrive, and then we'll get the comparison. Does the overdrive actually help it enough to make it worth the money? Stay tuned. Right. Now for the purposes of this video, we're going to be using my wide body C10 here. It's going to be set up exactly the same way in the before and after, the only difference being that Treal overdrive. So currently there is no overdrive in this truck. This is still stock gearing, front and rear axle. But I did just pick up a Treal overdrive for this. Now this is the same overdrive that I have in my Jeep, and it definitely seemed to help that out a lot. So we'll see what it does for this truck. Now if you want to see a full build breakdown on this truck, that is a video that I am working on. I'm not sure yet when I'm going to post it. It might be next week, if not week after. We'll see. Now, as of right now, I've already filmed the before footage. So to get this thing ready for the install, I did wash the tires off just to get the snow and whatnot off of them. So they are a lot cleaner now than they were when I filmed the before footage. And with these pit bull rockers, the cleaner they are, the stickier they are. So after we get the overdrive put in, I'm going to go ahead and run it around on the indoor course a little bit just to get the tires dusted back up, so it's really a fair comparison before and after. So first off, what is overdrive? You can see here I've got a little strip of tape put on both tires. Now stock, your front and rear axle gearing is going to be the same in these SCX24s. So if you could give it just a little bit of throttle here. First of all, you can see just how much lash is actually in those gears and how much play there is. But you can see there, the front and rear axle are turning at the same speed. So for each revolution that the rear axle does, the front axle is also going to do one revolution. And of course, with the amount of play that there is in the whole gearing setup throughout the entire truck, there's obviously going to be a little bit of variation there, but it is what it is. Now when it comes to RC crawlers, there's usually a couple of different ways that you can get overdrive into your rig. With these SCX24s, the easiest way is by changing your front axle gears, which is what this kit from Treal does. Now this is a 213T gear set. They also make a 214T. The 214 gives you about a 14% overdrive in your front axle, meaning your front axle will turn 14% faster than your rear. These 213s give you about a 23% overdrive. Now, I believe I've also seen kits out there that give you up to like a 30 to 33% front overdrive. And there's also kits for these now where you can actually put an overdrive directly into the transmission. Now, you could also couple that with overdrive axles in one or both axles to not only give yourself a front overdrive, but to also give yourself a higher gear ratio for a higher top speed. Which you could also do with your stock transmission. If you didn't want a front overdrive, you could just go ahead and throw a set of these in the front and the rear and increase your top speed. Then there's also underdrive gears, which are generally put in the rear to slow the rear down without changing the gear ratio in the front. And it really all comes down to personal preference, the way your rig is set up and what you're trying to do with it. So obviously the first step with a new overdrive is to get it installed. Now usually the easiest way to install an overdrive is to go ahead and drop your whole front axle right out of the truck. But with this C10 where it's on a FuriTech Grasshopper chassis, my links are nut and bolted in, and it's just a lot of a pain to get everything out. So we're going to go ahead and do it right in the truck. Now step one is going to be to go ahead and get your tires and wheels off. Now once you've done that, you're going to go ahead, we're going to remove our steering links. And the easiest way to do that on this truck, where I have my link arm through bolted to my servo horn with a nut, I'm going to go ahead and just pop the servo horn right off the servo, get the steering links out of the way, unbolt them off the knuckles, and then we're going to go ahead and get the knuckles off so we can actually pull our stub shafts and our axle shafts right out of the housing. Okay, so once you've got your front end all disassembled to this point, you're just going to go ahead and pull your axle shafts right out. And then you're going to take your diff cover off. Now keep in mind that the two top bolts of the diff cover also hold your servo tray on, as well as your upper link mounts. So I usually like to get those two first. Get them right out of the way. And then I can just separate that servo tray and swing that right up out of my way. And then I've got plenty of room to work. Now I'm not sure what it's going to look like inside this axle. I'm also going to go ahead and take my rear axle apart and just get it cleaned out, get some grease in there. I haven't had these axles opened up since I bought this truck, so they're actually not too bad, which is a surprise considering how much water this thing has been run in. But now the next step, you want to try to do this without splitting your drive shaft. But we're just going to go ahead and pop that drive shaft right off from that worm gear so that that can come out. Get that right out of the way. And we can pop that drive shaft right off. Leave that out of the way. And then you can go ahead and walk out your worm gear. And your spur gear. Now when I opened this truck up, when I first bought it, both axles actually had plenty of grease in them, but that's something I definitely recommend that you do anytime you buy a new SCX24. Just pop those diff covers off, take a look inside, and make sure they're greased. I have heard plenty of stories of some of them not getting properly greased. But now once you've got that all apart, you can go ahead and get your new parts installed. Now, hopefully you can see it on here, if the camera will focus on it. There's a little O-ring on the back side of that worm gear. And there isn't one on the front side. So one thing you want to do is make sure you look. Usually there isn't one, but I have seen them on my Jeep where there was a O-ring on the front side up against the bearing, the input bearing for that worm gear. So you just want to check and make sure that there isn't one stuck in there, because there was on my Jeep. Now the purpose of these little O-rings really is just to kind of shim the gears out so that there's not too much play in them. And Treal does provide new O-rings with your Overdrive kit. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to slide one of them right onto our new worm gear here. We're also going to double check real quick, make sure our bearing and our diff cover is still seated properly. And now, where I've got the Samix diff covers on these, as I said, I've already had these diff covers off and check everything out. So I know everything is properly greased, but I am going to go ahead and throw just a little bit more in there when I put it together. And I've just been using this ProTech RC Premium White Gear Grease. Seems to work great. Comes in this handy little syringe tube. You can also get it in a bigger tub if you need more. But all we're going to do is we're going to make sure we put our other bearing in. I usually like to start one axle shaft from my bottom side if I'm working on its side like this. Get that axle shaft pushed up in so it's just starting into that bearing. And then I will set my spur gear in there and try to get those lined up. And it usually takes a little bit of fiddling. But eventually, you do get it. And now once I've got that in there, I'm going to keep my thumb down here under this end to hold that axle shaft in. And then I'm going to slide my other bearing in on top of that gear. And then start my other axle shaft in down from the other side. And then get it lined up and dropped in place. Now, as I said, all these little parts can be a little fiddly, but there. Once we get it dropped in place, you should be able to turn that gear and feel both axle shafts turning. So now once we get that where we want it, we're going to go ahead and just push our worm gear right in. And then we're going to add just a little bit of grease here. Doesn't really take much in these little axles. That's usually about all I do. And then we're going to go ahead and reinstall our diff cover. Again, you want to make sure you keep holding those axle shafts in so they can't fall out. So I usually like to start one, and then I'll go diagonally up to the center and start the next one. And now I'm just running these in just barely snugged right now. Just enough to hold them there. We'll get those four started in. Then we'll sit the truck back, or at least the axle back, kind of upright here. And I usually like to give my input a few good spins just to kind of start working that grease around in there a little bit. And then we can get it into position to reattach our front drive shaft. And now, if your drive shaft pops out like mine just did, you want to make sure when it goes together that it's back in phase. You do not want an out of phase drive shaft. And then we can drop our servo tray back in place. Wind these two screws back in. And then once you've got all of that bolted back together tight, you can go ahead and just reassemble everything with your knuckles, your steering links, and all that. Now you want to make sure too, once you get your gears reinstalled, just kind of push back and forth on your drive shaft. Make sure there's not too much play in that worm gear. If there is, you can pull your cover back off and then add another O-ring to the input side to space that out and try to take that play out. This one is nice and tight. Alright, so now that we've got everything reinstalled and the tires and wheels bolted back on, I'll show you just what that overdrive does. So now you can see, after one full revolution of the front axle, the rear has only made about 3/4 of a revolution, give or take, a little bit more. And then we'll go for another full revolution on the front axle. And that rear is only made just over a half a revolution. So you can see there just how much that front overdrive actually makes that front axle turn faster than the rear. And now the thought process behind it is, with your front axle turning faster than your rear, it will actually help pull the truck up over obstacles and help keep that front end planted a little bit better on some of the steeper climbs. Does it actually work that way? Let's go find out. Alright, so hopefully you guys can see the overdrive has made a slight improvement in this C10. Now the amount of performance gain you're actually going to see with an overdrive is going to depend very heavily on a lot of factors. Primarily how your truck is set up, suspension wise, what tires and wheels you're running, what motor you're running, and also what kind of terrain you're on, your driving style even, and also the amount of overdrive that you put in. You might find that a 14% overdrive lends itself better to your rig for your trail conditions and your driving style than a 23% overdrive. You may find that an underdrive in the rear works better. So really it all comes down to just kind of playing around to see what works for you. But as for whether or not I can recommend this Treal overdrive, absolutely. It's not super pricey, and it does give you enough of a performance gain in most situations to make it worth the money. Now with this truck set up the way it is, I can't fully capitalize on the Overdrive because of how much my front suspension unloads on steeper climbs. But I built this as a trail truck. It's very rear heavy with that Blazer cap on it. But for what I generally do with it, it's set up very well and it works very well. If I was doing more comp-centered stuff with it and doing a lot more steeper obstacles, I would have to do some limit straps or something in the front end to keep that front axle from unloading. But as I said, for what I actually do with it most of the time and what I built it for, the way it's set up right now works perfect. And that Overdrive is going to help it along in a lot of situations like you're seeing here out in this shallow snow. So, hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something today and got something good out of this. And we'll see you next time.